Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, today we are unpacking a truly fascinating document. We're looking at a text called I Have an Ideal by Xu Feng, which operates as this sweeping, highly passionate utopian manifesto. Now, what makes this text so incredibly compelling to analyze is how it attempts to do two massive things all at once. First, it diagnoses a total modern societal collapse. And second, it proposes a highly radical, spiritual, and ultimately utopian solution. So as we walk through these ideas today, we're going to impartially break down the exact architecture of the author's arguments just to see exactly how he constructs this worldview.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's how we're breaking it down. We'll start with the Great Road of Life, move through the modern spiritual wasteland and society's false prophets, and then we'll end up at the proposed solutions in Returning to the Source and a Utopian Vision. So starting off with Section 1, the Great Road of Life. This covers humanity's historical and spiritual divergence. The author begins by rooting his entire argument in the past. He's establishing a baseline of where we came from, really to highlight how far we've supposedly fallen. The text maps out human progression, or, well, rather regression. In centuries past, the author argues that humanity was actually guided by ancient sages, immortals, and major religious figures like Jesus and Sakyamuni. Basically, figures who laid out a clear spiritual path. But looking at the present, the text argues that we have become completely blinded by what the author calls the dense fog of civilization, and the warning for the future is stark. If we stay on this current trajectory, we're risking the absolute ruin of the earth and mankind itself.
And this brings us to a really central metaphor in the text. The manifesto argues that, blinded by the dense fog of civilization, mankind has been straying further and further away from the Great Road. Notice how civilization is placed in quotes there. The author is completely inverting the traditional view of human progress. Instead of civilization acting as this illuminating force that brings us out of the dark, the manifesto argues it's actually a dense, disorienting fog that has caused us to totally lose our way.
All right, moving right along to Section 2, the modern spiritual wasteland. Here, we look at the illusion of material prosperity.
And this brilliantly illustrates the author's critique of the present day. Transitioning to the modern era, his core diagnosis is quite specific. The problem isn't a lack of material resources. The actual problem is a profound spiritual poverty. We see our obsession with creating lifeless skyscrapers and manufacturing luxury products contrasted sharply with the grim reality of starving children and the poverty-stricken who can't even afford basic medical care. The manifesto presents this not just as an economic failure, but as a deep moral mockery. It's a blasphemy against life itself. We're building higher and higher, all while completely ignoring basic human suffering down at the ground level.
Which leads us to this definitive statement. The wasteland of spirit and soul is the real source of human suffering. According to the manifesto, humanity's plight just isn't material. Trying to solve this deep spiritual desolation simply by acquiring more material wealth is, as the author dramatically puts it, like trying to quench your thirst with poisoned wine. It doesn't help. It only accelerates the destruction.
And this spiritual wasteland is further complicated by an information crisis. The text suggests that being engulfed in modern media, television, networks, books, it doesn't actually make us smarter. Instead, consuming these massive mountains of data causes spiritual indigestion, malnutrition, and ill health. The pursuit of knowledge, according to the author, has mutated into a morbid thirst. Rather than enlightening us, the text claims that modern media just acts as fertile soil for breeding ignorance and manic, blind adherence. The idea is, the more we unthinkingly swallow, the less we actually understand.
That brings us to Section 3, Society's False Prophets, focusing on critiques of modern institutions and the literati.
So the crucial point is that as we move into his institutional critiques, the author's agitation really peaks. How exactly does he define structural corruption? Well, he lays out incredibly specific, unyielding criteria. An era is categorized as demonic if human dignity is determined by money and social status rather than moral character. A society is evil if people get rich through speculation and plundering rather than honest labor. A government is despotic if it actively forces out new thinking to keep people locked in ignorance. And a nation is insane if it instigates violence instead of dedicating itself to love. It's a sweeping, completely comprehensive indictment of the entire modern systemic structure.
And who does the author blame for maintaining this whole structure? The intellectuals, the literati. The manifesto accuses modern writers and thinkers of operating under massive pretense.
They publicly claim they're maintaining stability, pursuing freedom, adhering to belief, and promoting morality. But, the text argues, they're actually fabricating cultural garbage. They're producing what he calls rancid articles that act as spiritual drugs, distorting values and polluting the pure heart.
To drive this point home, the author poses a rhetorical question to these academics. Can you expect any egg to remain intact if the nest is overturned? The text challenges those who hide in ivory towers, burying themselves in academic papers, believing they can just ignore the massive societal collapse happening right outside their windows. The author is stating that when the structural foundation of society falls, literally no one's isolated, comfortable shelter will survive.
Now for the pivot. Section 4, returning to the source, finding the homestead for spirit and soul.
We're now shifting to the solution phase of the explainer. Having diagnosed the disease, the author now prescribes the cure, warning that any dawdling or non-action right now will only speed up the approach of doomsday. The core of the solution revolves around a concept defined in the text as Lifechanyuan. This is proposed as a spiritual homestead and a fraternal movement. It acts as the author's physical and spiritual refuge for those who truly yearn to escape the chaos of the modern world. And the stated goal is highly poetic: to transform the jarring, disconnected hullabaloo of modern society into a convivial, unified symphony of life. Let's move to and see how this builds, because to reach this spiritual homestead, the text prescribes 3 actionable steps. Step 1. Humanity must actively fill up the abyss that centuries of our blind, destructive behavior have dug. Step 2. We must cultivate reverence for what the author calls the greatest creator, arguing that it's only before this creator that humans can find truly equal dignity. And finally, step 3. We have to stop merely consuming raw knowledge and instead transform it into true wisdom, so we can finally embark on the road of life.
This entire solution is anchored in a philosophy of radical interconnectedness. If our brothers are suffering starvation, we cannot swallow the dainty food in our mouths. The author emphasizes that true freedom is simply impossible if our neighbors are still in chains, or if people in remote areas are crying while we enjoy the luxury of big cities. It's really an all-or-nothing view of human salvation. We absolutely cannot be saved individually if the collective is suffering.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, a utopian vision. The 1,000-year world.
We've reached the final section of the text, where we explore the specific, seemingly supernatural endpoint the author envisions for humanity once it embraces his ideals. This endpoint is defined as the 1,000-year world. It's described as an oasis of spirit and soul. It is the ultimate promised land, meant to serve as an auspicious habitat during a millennium of peace. The key phrase here is that people will be eternally severed from the abyss of suffering. So the author isn't just proposing temporary relief, he's proposing a permanent state of serenity and freedom for body and mind. And the text uses incredibly striking imagery to describe how this is actually going to happen. The author views this not as some distant, impossible golden fantasy, but as an imminent transformation that will be triggered by a sudden, mysterious, supernatural power. When this happens, the polluted rivers will instantly become clear. The turbid sky will shift into expanses of colorful clouds, and a free rhythm of life will reverberate across every inch of the land. It's framed as a total, magical restoration of the natural world. To conclude his manifesto, the author synthesizes the major religious figures he introduced at the very beginning. The closing quotes read, "Eternal virtue remains with Jesus Christ, supreme wisdom is ascribed to Sakyamuni, eternal glory belongs to the greatest creator." He brings the historical arc full circle, unifying these massive spiritual icons into one single conclusion, essentially suggesting that his vision is the culmination of all their ancient teachings.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the author turns the lens right back on us, the readers, with a provocative question. If great wisdom truly descends from heaven, do we actually have the broadness of mind to recognize it, or have we been permanently blinded by that dense fog of civilization? It's a powerful challenge for sure, urging us to reflect on our own spiritual awareness and whether we're even capable of seeing the great road if it was placed right in front of us. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the architecture of Sui Feng's utopian vision.